Has there ever been a time in your life when you fought really hard for something? When you struggled and pushed yourself and did everything you could to achieve some goal? Have you ever wondered if you could ever actually do something or learn something and you felt like nothing like failure, but you just determined to push through to the end? And maybe you're right now in the middle of that and not sure if you're going to get there. Well, hey, I'm Dr. Rob. This is Biblical Genetics. I'm sitting on top of a mountain in Norway. This is a place called the pulpit. In Norwegian translation, I think it means preacher's stool, but it's the pulpit. It's a famous monument. Lots of people coming up here every day, but it's kind of late in the day right now. It's after 9 o'clock, even though the sun is still up because, we're far north. Now, even though a lot of people come up here every day, I'm not nearly as young as I used to be. It was a big effort to get up here. My heart, my knees, my toes, they're all feeling it. They're feeling like, oh, I wish I was 20 years old again. But I'm not. But then again, I'm glad I'm not. Because in the last 30, 40, 50 years, I've learned so many things. So many things specifically about God, about Christianity, about the Bible. Now here on Biblical Genetics, I've been going through a series on genealogy. And genealogies are one of the hardest things in the Bible. Yeah, some of the theological positions like the Trinity and maybe end times theology, those are hard also. But genealogy is a place where a lot of people read and they just skip over it or they give up entirely. So I just want to give you a couple of pointers to help you through some of the more difficult places. There's three that I want to talk about specifically. One is, if you're trying to build a timeline of Earth's history, you have to use those genealogies. But if you start in Genesis chapter 5 with Adam and how old he was when Seth is born, and you go on to Noah, and Noah's over 500 years old when his children are born. But it doesn't tell us how old he actually is. But then you go over to Genesis chapter 11, and it picks up again with the son of Noah, Shem, and how old he is when Arphaxad is born. But if we don't know how old Noah was when Shem is born, you can't actually link the two genealogies directly together. Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 are kind of like hanging out in space. So how do you link them together? You have to go somewhere else. The Bible says that Noah is 600 years old when the flood starts. Okay? But it also says that Arphaxad is born 2 years after the flood. Oh, okay, so we can skip Shem entirely. We go from Noah's 600th year to Arphaxad. Except there's a question. What does 2 years after the flood mean? Is it 24 months after the flood? Is it the second spring after the flood? And is it the beginning of the flood or the end of the flood? Some scholars think the Mabul, the flood, only applies to the first 40 days. Well, okay, so 40 days of flooding and then over nearly a year of floating. What is this 2 years after the flood thing? So the chronology here is a little bit difficult to work out. In fact, you can't work it out perfectly, which is one reason why I don't hold to Archbishop Ussher's 4004 BC, because you can't be that specific. And this is one example of a place where there's a little bit of ambiguity. It's not error, it's not mistake, it's an uncertainty, because the purpose of the Bible is not to give us an all-comprehensive minute-by-minute account of world history. The purpose of the Bible is to point us to Jesus. It's essentially the story of God finding a bride for his son. That's what the Bible is. Yes, there's history, yes, there's genealogy, yes, there's chronology. But the purpose is not chronology. Therefore, there's a couple of places in chronology where we left scratching our heads. We don't exactly know. But that's example number one. Example number two deals with Abraham. Abraham is living in a place called Ur. Most people put Ur down in southeast Babylonia. I don't like that. I think it's probably Urfa, which is a town right next to Haran, which is where Abraham went and where his father died. But we know how old his father was when he died. And we know that Abraham was 75 years old when he left. But the Bible doesn't specifically say that Abraham was 75 when his father died. We kind of make that assumption, but there's a gray area. He could have left before his father died. He could have left at a certain time. He could have left after his father died. We're not actually told specifically. So even though most of us read it that Abraham was 75 when his father died, he might have left Haran before that when God called him. Again, it's just another ambiguity, a little bit of uncertainty, not an error. It's just a place where we can't actually know specifically. The third place where there's a little bit of ambiguity comes to the question of how long the Israelites were in Egypt. Most people, myself included for many years, would say, well, it says 430 years to the day. That's when they came out. Therefore, they were in Egypt for 430 years. But Galatians chapter 3 says that God made the promise to Abraham and his seed, who is Christ, 430 years later they came out of Egypt. So it sounds like Paul believes that they were in Egypt for less than 430 years. In fact, if you work it out in the genealogical details, it's about 215 years from when the promise is made, when Abraham is 75, until they, and then 215 years in Egypt, that's 430 years total. Except that promise wasn't made when Abraham was 75. I think this is a mistake that Archbishop Usher made. It's an easy one to make, but Abraham was given several promises, but there's one specific promise that happened when Abraham cut the pieces of the meat in half, of the animal in half, and then he fell asleep and he saw a vision of a smoking fire pot and a torch going through the pieces. That's the promise that was made to Abraham, the very important promise from God to Abraham. It's a one-sided providence, a one-sided covenant where God says, I'm going to fulfill this bargain myself, Abraham. You're actually not part of the bargain. God made a promise to Abraham, but it was a one-sided promise, a very important one, that he would get land, that there would be a seed, which is Christ, and there would be a blessing, a world blessing coming from Abraham. Okay? But Abraham left Haran when he was 75. Before God made that promise to Abraham, he moved to Shechem, he moved to Bethel, he moved down to the Negev. There was a famine. He went to Egypt. He came back from Egypt. He moved back north again. I think he moved one more time again. He went to rescue Lot. He gave tithes to Melchizedek. There's a lot of story, a lot of very fun, interesting historical account details that are in there between his 75th birthday and when God made the promise. So he made the promise before Ishmael was born, when Abraham, I think, was 87. So sometime between 75 and 87, probably closer to 87 than 75. That affects the history of the world. That affects the age of the universe. That affects how long they were in Egypt. That's a very interesting question, but I know it's a nothing. It's just a little teeny, hyper nerdy detail. But if you've ever sat down and tried to figure out what's the age of the earth according to the Bible, those are the things you're going to run into. And you can't build the history of the earth unless you have the genealogical details. Therefore, we have to understand the genealogies. Okay, that's all I want to say. I'm going to actually start hiking back down now. I see my group coming down the hill, and I'm going to follow them down. We got some people that aren't quite as spry as me even, so I'm going to stay in the back just to make sure we help everyone down, because we got a 4-kilometer hike, and it's well, right behind me in the cliff. It's 2,000 feet straight down to a river or to a fjord. And there's a lot of scrambling to do, a lot of rocks, a lot of boulders, bridges, sometimes hands and feet. Usually we can walk, sometimes the handrail. But this is amazing. Honestly, I feel a little guilty for taking this trip. This is a dream trip. I've always wanted to come to Norway. In fact, the other night, as I said in one of my other videos, the other night I had a conference right down the road from where my great-grandfather came from. And I got to explore that area. I just had one day, but I went there, and then a man that was there, I said where my great-great-grandmother was born. He goes, oh, that's the farm right next to mine. And so we went and toured the farm. He called up the owner, and we just went over there, and he showed us around. And I mean, what an amazing thing. So I can't believe that I get to work for Creation Ministries International that gives me opportunities like this. It is shocking and amazing, and honestly, I don't deserve it. I also don't deserve your support. For those of you who are helping me to keep my videos online, I really do appreciate it. There's support down in the links below. But I'm not making money on this trip. In fact, it was paid for by other people. In fact, I would never have ever been able to afford to come on this trip. But I've spoken to 64 people and 200 people. I gave 3 lectures over this weekend on the West Coast. And I gave one lecture in central Norway, going back to Oslo tomorrow. Get to explore that wonderful city for one more day. And then I fly home. And I'm doing this because I love the Bible. I want to encourage people that the Bible is true. And because I'm a nerd, I'm going to dig into some of the details and try to figure out some of the things that are hard and try to simplify them, try to explain them to people. And I hope you understand my little explanation here of those 3 points that sometimes are difficult, but they're not that hard. But we can work through those sorts of things. We can have a really good understanding of biblical history and how the pieces tie together, and how the Bible is one unified whole, one complete story that's not about Adam, it's not about Noah, it's not about Abraham, it's about Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world.